September 1940. The Mediterranean sun beats down on the blue waters off the coast of Libya. An Italian submarine, the Galileo Galilei, glides beneath the surface. Her crew of 45 men work in practiced silence, confident in their vessel's power. This is no ordinary submarine. She's armed with torpedoes, deck guns, and the pride of Mussolini's naval fleet. But in just a few hours, something absolutely extraordinary is going to happen. Something so bizarre that when the reports first came in, British Naval Command thought it was a joke. This submarine, this weapon of war, is about to surrender to a fishing boat. Not a warship, not a destroyer. A fishing boat with a crew of fishermen armed with nothing more than rifles and sheer audacity. And the story of how this happened reveals one of the most incredible tales of World War II that hardly anyone knows about. Now, before we get into the heart of this story, you need to understand something about submarines in 1940. These weren't the sophisticated vessels we think of today. They were dark, cramped metal tubes that smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. The heat inside could reach over 100 degrees. Men lived shoulder to shoulder, sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough bunks. Fresh water was so scarce that sailors couldn't wash. They grew beards because shaving was impossible. And the danger. Every time you dove, you were trusting your life to bolts and rivets that could fail at any moment. One leak, one malfunction, and you'd either drown or suffocate in the depths. The Galileo Galilei was actually one of the better submarines in the Italian fleet. She'd been built in 1934, measured 230 feet long, and could dive to depths that would crush a man's lungs if he were exposed to the pressure. Her commander, Capitano di Corvetta Corrado Nardi, was experienced and respected. He'd taken her on patrol after patrol, hunting British shipping in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. For months, the Galileo Galilei had been a thorn in Britain's side, disrupting supply lines that were vital to the war effort. But on this particular day, June 19, 1940, something went wrong, terribly wrong. The submarine was patrolling near the coast when she was spotted by British aircraft. Now, getting spotted from the air was every submarine commander's nightmare. You see, from above, a submarine just below the surface looks like a dark shadow in the water. And once you're seen, you're in serious trouble. The British planes radioed her position, and before Commander Nardi could react, his submarine was under attack. Depth charges began falling from the sky, hitting the water with massive splashes before sinking down and exploding. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the water that could buckle steel plates, shatter instruments, and rupture a submarine's hull. Inside the Galileo Galilei, the crew was thrown around like rag dolls. Lights flickered and died. Water began spraying from broken pipes. Men screamed as the submarine shuddered from the concussive force of the explosions. Nardi ordered emergency maneuvers, trying desperately to evade the attacks, but the depth charges kept coming. Then something catastrophic happened. A near miss didn't sink the submarine, but it damaged something critical. The vessel began taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. Even worse, the diving planes, the control surfaces that allow a submarine to change depth, were damaged. Nardi realized they had to surface. Staying underwater meant certain death. So up they came, breaching the surface like a wounded whale, water cascading off her conning tower. But surfacing brought its own problems. Now they were completely exposed, a sitting target for any aircraft or warship in the area. The crew scrambled to man the deck guns, preparing to fight it off if more planes came. Some men worked frantically to repair the damage while others scanned the horizon for threats. The submarine was crippled but not dead. Not yet. What happened next is where our story takes its strange turn. Out of the morning haze came a vessel, but it wasn't a British destroyer or cruiser. It was a trawler, a small fishing boat called the Moonstone. She was commandeered by the British Royal Navy for patrol duties, but make no mistake, this was not a warship. She was 70 feet of wood and determination, armed with a single small deck gun and carrying about a dozen men, mostly fishermen in uniform. Her commander was Lieutenant Claude Seymour, a reservist who'd spent most of his life catching fish, not fighting wars. When Seymour spotted the submarine through his binoculars, he must have felt his stomach drop. Here he was in a glorified fishing boat, facing a military submarine that could blow him out of the water with a single torpedo. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would have been to radio for help and keep his distance. But Seymour didn't do the smart thing. He did something absolutely mad. He turned his little trawler toward the submarine and opened fire with his single gun. Think about the absurdity of this for a moment. A fishing boat attacking a submarine. It's like a house cat charging at a lion. The crew of the Galileo Galilei must have thought the British had lost their minds. But here's what made this moment so critical. The Italian submarine was hurt, vulnerable, and her crew was exhausted and shaken from the depth charge attack. Their morale was broken. They'd been through hours of terror underwater, convinced they were going to die. And now, just when they'd surfaced hoping for safety, they were under attack again. Meanwhile, Seymour's audacity gave the impression that he must have backup coming. Why else would such a small vessel dare to attack? The Italians assumed that behind this trawler must be destroyers, cruisers, maybe even a battleship steaming over the horizon. Surely this little boat was just the first wave. Commander Nardi faced an impossible decision. His submarine was damaged, taking on water and unable to dive. If he tried to fight and British warships really were coming, his crew would die. If he tried to run on the surface, they'd be hunted down. His men were exhausted, some wounded, all terrified. The depth charge attack had shattered their confidence. And this crazy British trawler just kept coming, firing its little gun with determination that seemed to suggest overwhelming force was about to arrive. So Nardi made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his crew to abandon ship. The men poured out of the hatches, some jumping straight into the sea, others climbing into the submarine's life rafts. They left behind their weapons, their supplies, everything. And as Lieutenant Seymour approached in his fishing boat, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The submarine crew was surrendering to him, to his little fishing boat and his crew of former fishermen. But the story gets even more remarkable. Seymour, showing extraordinary presence of mind, realized he had a chance to do something incredible. If he could board the submarine before the Italians scuttled her, he could capture her intact. A functioning enemy submarine would be an intelligence goldmine. So while his crew kept their rifles trained on the Italians in the water, Seymour and a few brave men climbed aboard the Galileo Galilei. They went through the hatches into the dark, flooded interior of the submarine, not knowing if demolition charges had been set, not knowing if Italian sailors were still hiding inside ready to fight. Every step was a gamble. The submarine could have exploded at any moment, but they pushed forward, and what they found was astonishing. The Italians had left in such a panic that they hadn't properly destroyed their code books, their charts, or their equipment. Everything was still there. The British had just won a treasure trove of intelligence. Seymour's men worked quickly to stop the flooding and stabilize the submarine. They discovered that while she was damaged, she wasn't beyond saving. And so, in one of the strangest sights of World War II, a fishing boat towed a captured Italian submarine back to port. When they arrived at Aden, the British naval officers couldn't believe it. They'd heard the radio reports but assumed there must have been some mistake in the transmission. A fishing boat had captured a submarine. Impossible. But there it was, the Galileo Galilei, floating proof of the most improbable victory. The intelligence gathered from the submarine proved invaluable. The British discovered Italian naval codes, patrol routes, and communication procedures. They learned about weaknesses in Italian submarine design and tactics. This information helped the Royal Navy hunt down other Italian submarines with devastating effectiveness in the months that followed. As for Commander Nardi and his crew, they became prisoners of war. Nardi was devastated. He'd lost his submarine not in a fair fight, not to a superior enemy force, but to a fishing boat. The shame was unbearable. When other Italian officers heard the story, many refused to believe it. Some thought Nardi must have been a coward or a traitor, but the truth was more complex and more human. Nardi had made a decision based on incomplete information, and the genuine belief that he was saving his crew from annihilation. He thought he was facing the advance guard of a major British force. He couldn't have known that behind that brave little trawler was nothing but open sea. In the chaos and terror of combat, exhausted and frightened, he made the choice that seemed most likely to keep his men alive. The crew of the Moonstone became instant heroes. Lieutenant Seymour received commendations and medals. His fishermen-turned-sailors were celebrated for their courage. And that little trawler, she went on serving throughout the war, continuing her patrol duties in the Red Sea, though she never again encountered anything quite as dramatic as a submarine surrender. But here's something that really brings this story into focus. After the war ended, historians and naval experts studied the incident carefully. They interviewed survivors from both sides, and what emerged was a picture of just how much World War II in the Mediterranean was defined by confusion, fear, and split-second decisions made with incomplete information. The Galileo Galilei incident wasn't really about incompetence or cowardice. It was about the fog of war, about how combat creates situations where even experienced commanders can misjudge what's happening. Consider what Commander Nardi knew at the moment of surrender. His submarine had been depth-charged for hours. She was damaged and taking on water. His crew was on the verge of psychological collapse. He'd surfaced into what appeared to be a trap, with an enemy vessel immediately engaging him. Every instinct, every bit of his training, told him that this small trawler must be part of a larger force. In the Royal Navy's own doctrine, small patrol vessels were supposed to locate and harass enemy submarines while calling in heavier units to make the kill. So Nardi's assumption was actually logical based on standard tactics. He had no way of knowing that the Moonstone was alone, that no destroyers were coming, that this was just a courageous fishing boat with a crazy commander. And here's something else to think about. If Nardi had chosen to fight, if he'd recognized the Moonstone for what it was and opened fire with his deck guns, he probably would have sunk her. His submarine was bigger, better armed, and even damaged. She could have destroyed the trawler. But then what? British aircraft knew exactly where he was. His submarine couldn't dive. He'd have been hunted down and sunk within hours anyway, and all of Seymour's men would have died for nothing. So maybe Nardi's decision, humiliating as it was, actually saved lives on both sides. Maybe in that moment of surrender, he was being more humane than he realized. The Italian Navy didn't see it that way, of course. When the full story came out, Nardi was court-martialed in absentia. His career was destroyed. Other submarine commanders used his story as a cautionary tale about maintaining fighting spirit no matter the odds, but some of his crew defended him. They said he'd saved their lives when continuing to fight would have been pointless suicide. They said the depth charge attack had been so severe that the submarine was already doomed. These men had been there, had felt the hull buckling around them, had breathed air thick with diesel fumes and fear, and they knew that surrender wasn't cowardice but pragmatism. The Galileo Galilei herself had an interesting fate. The British repaired her and studied her thoroughly. They considered putting her into service under the Royal Navy flag, but ultimately decided she wasn't worth the effort. Italian submarines were good but not exceptional, and the British had plenty of their own boats. So after extracting every bit of useful intelligence, they scrapped her. The submarine that had survived depth charges and capture ended her days being cut apart in a shipyard, her steel recycled for the war effort. But her legacy lived on in the intelligence she provided, and in the story of her surrender, which became one of the most told and retold tales of naval warfare. You know what strikes me most about this whole incident? It's how it reveals the human element in war. We often think of World War II as a clash of nations and ideologies, of grand strategies and massive battles. And it was all those things. But it was also made up of millions of small moments where individual people had to make choices under impossible pressure. Commander Nardi wasn't a villain. He was a man trying to do his job, trying to keep his crew alive, making decisions with imperfect information in the worst circumstances imaginable. Lieutenant Seymour wasn't a superhero. He was a fisherman in uniform who saw an opportunity and had the guts to take it, even though by all logic he should have kept his distance and waited for real warships. Story of the Galileo Galilei also reminds us that war is unpredictable. No amount of training or preparation can account for every possibility. Sometimes a fishing boat captures a submarine. Sometimes the underdog wins not through superior force but through sheer audacity and luck. Sometimes the most logical decision turns out to be wrong, and the crazy decision turns out to be brilliant. That's the nature of combat. That's the nature of crisis. You make your choice and live with the consequences. For decades after the war, veterans from both sides of this encounter would meet occasionally at naval reunions and commemorations. The survivors of the Galileo Galilei and the crew of the Moonstone would share drinks and tell stories, laughing about the absurdity of that day in June 1940. The shame and pride faded with time, replaced by a kind of mutual respect. They'd all been there. They'd all faced the chaos and terror. They all understood what it meant to serve in conditions where death could come from above or below at any moment. Lieutenant Seymour lived to old age, and whenever he was asked about his moment of glory, he always insisted he'd just done what seemed right at the time. He never claimed to be a hero. He said he'd been scared out of his mind approaching that submarine, convinced they were all going to die. But he'd also been determined not to let fear paralyze him. So he'd done something instead of nothing, and it had worked out. Commander Nardi never really recovered from the shame of the surrender. After the war, he lived quietly, avoiding naval circles where his name carried the stigma of that day. Some of his former crew members tried to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he'd been in an impossible situation and had made the most humane choice available. But the court of public opinion, especially in military circles, was harsh. The story of the submarine surrendering to a fishing boat was just too bizarre, too embarrassing for people to see past it to the complex reality underneath. And what about the fishing boat itself, the Moonstone? She survived the war and returned to civilian service, going back to catching fish in peaceful waters. Her brief moment of martial glory became a footnote, remembered by fewer and fewer people as the years passed. Eventually she was retired and broken up, her wood and metal dispersed, her story fading into the vast archive of World War II history that most people never learn about. But historians treasure this story because it's so revealing about the nature of naval warfare in the Mediterranean. This wasn't the Atlantic with its vast convoy battles and wolf packs of U-boats. This was a smaller, stranger theater where ancient rivalries played out with modern weapons, where the sea was more constrained, and every encounter could be weird and unexpected. The Mediterranean in World War II saw Australian ships fighting French ships, German submarines hunting in waters where galleys had once rode, British forces capturing Italian colonies that had been Roman provinces 2,000 years earlier. History folded in on itself. And in that context, a fishing boat capturing a submarine doesn't seem quite so impossible. It seems like exactly the kind of strange, human, unpredictable event that war generates when it's fought in close quarters by exhausted men doing their best to survive. So what's the real lesson of the Galileo Galilei? Maybe it's that courage comes in unexpected forms. Maybe it's that assumptions can be fatal. Maybe it's that war is fundamentally chaotic, and no one really controls what happens once the shooting starts. Or maybe the lesson is simpler and more profound. Maybe it's just that every person involved in war is doing the best they can with what they know, and we should be slow to judge their choices from the safety and clarity of hindsight. The Italian submarine that surrendered to a fishing boat is remembered as a curiosity, an oddity in the naval history books. But for the men who were there, for the 45 Italian sailors who climbed out of that submarine thinking they were about to die, and for the dozen British fishermen who couldn't believe they'd just captured a warship, it was simply the most intense and terrifying day of their lives. A day when everything hung in the balance and could have gone a dozen different ways. A day when audacity and fear collided and produced an outcome no one could have predicted. That's what makes this story worth remembering. Not because it's funny or strange, though it's both those things, but because it's real. It happened. And it reminds us that history isn't made by nations and armies in the abstract. It's made by people like Nardi and Seymour, making choices in the moment, living with the consequences, and carrying those memories for the rest of their lives. The Mediterranean sun that beat down on the Galileo Galilei that day in 1940 has set and risen more than 30,000 times since then. Everyone who was there is gone now, but their story remains, a testament to the strange and human face of war.